My name is Bjarni Tryggvason. I was a former astronaut and flew on the space shuttle about 20 years ago. And I'm here basically as a consultant looking at some of the operations that they are using here in making this film, operations of the space shuttle, and then some guidance about the kind of language they would use and how they move about. Well, it's through actually another fellow who, ex-Air Force pilot who does air shows, and I do air shows, and so we meet every now and then, so I met him. And he acted as a consultant with these guys on the movie Midway, bringing his expertise as a fighter pilot into that. And they asked him if he could do this, and so he suggested, no, I should do it, because he doesn't know much about the shuttle. So he called me about a week and a half ago and say, hey, you want to go help these guys out because they need someone with expertise in space and space operations and shuttle operations. So that's how I came about. So it's been a pretty interesting project so far. Well, I actually flew as a payload specialist back in 1997 on the Discovery, Shuttle Discovery, back in STS-85 was the mission number. And then after that, and that flight was focused on doing science on the space shuttle, some of which I actually helped design. And then after that, I went through the mission specialist training, both for the space shuttle and the space station. But then a couple of years later, I kind of bailed out of it because my kids were kind of needing some of my time, so I didn't do a second flight. Anyhow, but I did a 12-day mission on the Space Shuttle Discovery. And then I've also been involved in designing science hardware. Some is flown on the Russian space station, some on the space shuttle, some is up on the current space station. And then I also design currently some essentially educational experiments in science, and they're flown on the space station basically once every year and a half or so. There's several areas. First is when you look at these cockpits and you see all these switches back here in the mid-deck here, and then in the front part of the cockpit, there's like a few hundred switches and things. So every now and then they're looking to throw a switch for something. And so I give them advice on where that kind of switch might be and what they do with it. And so they can just go naturally do something that actually is the right kind of a switch. So that's one of the things I'm doing. The other thing is when people are moving around in floating freely inside your spacecraft, you tend to move very gently and drift around a lot. The motions that we have when we're walking around the ground don't really replicate what happens when we're in this free falling environment or free floating environment inside the spacecraft. So I kind of coach the actors on how they should do some of their motions so it looks closer to what you would see the astronauts actually doing if they're inside their spacecraft. And then the dialogue, I've helped a little bit with just changing the dialogue here and there, just to bring some of the terminology kind of in line with real shuttle operations and how they would interact with each other. There's a very sort of strict protocol we use in the dialogue to make sure that communication is very clear and everybody understands it. So I've tweaked some of the dialogue, working with Roland and Harold, the writers and the director, just to tweak that dialogue so it's just more in line kind of with how people would actually communicate in the spacecraft. I've had the script for a couple of weeks now. They sent it to me a couple of weeks ago. And I've been through it in all the scenes, and then all the places where there is either an action, a switch throw of some kind, or a dialogue, either between them. You know, for instance, when somebody's in the cargo bay or doing something, the dialogue is such that you want to avoid any mistakes. So we tweak the dialogue to kind of line up with that. And then looking at the actions they're taken, in all the places where a bit of knowledge about how things actually happen in space, I've looked at that, and I've sat down with Harold Klosser, the main writer, and talked a little bit with Roland about, well, how would you really do this, and what would you really say? And so some of the dialogue that we're actually hearing is dialogue where I have helped them tweak the dialogue to be more in line with really how it would be in a real shuttle operation. Okay, the first thing is there is no such thing as zero gravity. This is a real misnomer and sort of a misunderstanding of what's going on. And I've had engineers and physicists talks that I've given make the same mistake. One time I was giving a talk and there was a physics professor and he said the same thing, there's no gravity in space. And I said, well, how then does the space shuttle or the space station stay in orbit around the Earth? The gravitational acceleration at the height of the space station or where the shuttle flies is 90% of what it is here. It's only diminished 10%. And if you didn't have that, you wouldn't stay in orbit. And so when you're floating inside there, it's not because there's no gravity. It's because you, inside the space shuttle, say, are in the same kind of orbit as the space shuttle. And so you are continually traveling around the Earth because of the gravitational acceleration, but you're basically following each other very closely. And so one compared to the other looks like they're floating, but they're actually both accelerating at a very high rate. It's really quite amazing because it's so easy to move around inside the spacecraft. You just put the slightest little push off a wall and you'll just float over until you come into another wall when you have to stop yourself. And so that's part of what I coach the astronauts, or the actors I should say here. You know, they're moving from one side to the other side. It's not like they walk over like we do, okay? It's just a little push, drift, and stop yourself. Or if you're rotating, you're gonna push, you rotate until you stop yourself. And so you end up with a little bit of change in your speed, say your motion, and then a constant drift until you stop yourself. So those are the things that I'm kind of showing them or coaching them on, so that the motions we see are in the camera are very similar to what you would expect to see inside the with astronauts inside the space shuttle. Part of it is you have to sort of stop making your legs your main way of moving around, because up there your legs don't do any good because you're not in contact with the floor. And so you use your hands a lot, and then you do things very gently, and every time you push one way with the hands, well, then you got to push the other way to stop yourself after a little while. So just getting them to have that in mind as they're doing their movements that they have to do as part of the scenes for the movie, as you have that in mind, then it becomes more realistic. It comes closer to what you would see happening if you're watching an astronaut floating around inside the space station. So those kind of things, that's really part of what it is I'm helping them come to kind of understand. It's about 1/6 the size of the Earth. It's actually, I guess, about the size of the United States if you actually look at it silhouetted against the U.S. Its gravitational field is about 1/6 of the Earth. So if you're bouncing around the moon, you would take sort of bigger, seemingly slow motion steps as you bound across. And if you look at videos of the Apollo astronauts, you see that's what they do. And it's because the gravitational acceleration is so much less on the moon than on the Earth. So if you push yourself up, you can go a little higher, and it takes you a little longer to come back down. So they kind of bounced around. That was the easy way to move. And that depends on the mass of the moon, of course. And the mass of the moon is 1/6 of the Earth, and so you end up with, it's actually a little less than 1/6 of the Earth, but you end up with 1/6 of the gravitational acceleration. A lot of people don't have the same science background that I might have, and so they come up with some explanation that kind of fits what they're able to think about and kind of their view of the world. And unfortunately, we see a lot of strange explanations. I've met quite a few people in talks I've given who think that the landings on the moon were all a hoax. Well, I used to share an office with John Young, who did 2 trips to the moon, one around the moon. I think it was Apollo 9 or 10 or something like that. And then he was one of the guys that went, I think it might have been Apollo 14 or 15, drove the moon buggy around. Well, I shared an office with this guy. I've met Buzz Aldrin, I've met Neil Armstrong, Harrison Schmitt. Like, I've met half the people that walked on the moon, and I have flown around the world, 189 times in the space shuttle. But there are still people that think, and one wonders why, that the world is flat and it's all a hoax. It's kind of a little bit baffling as to why people think that, given all of what we know about the Earth, about the solar system, about the universe. So it's a bit strange. So exactly why people think that, I don't know. What's really impressive is you have a large team of people here, a couple of hundred people, and they can go from one set to the next set pretty quick, you know, when you look at the big changes, and they all work really well together. There's very little debating back and forth and talking back and forth. Everybody seems to know what they're supposed to do and when they need to do it and get on and do it. And then there's some fine tuning with the chatting, but it's really neat to see this team of people working on this project, bringing it together. And it kind of reminds me of how we operate the space shuttle, the space station. The astronauts are on board in space, but there's a big team of people on the ground in mission control and all the engineering teams behind them. And the astronauts never do anything without coordinating and talking with people on the ground. And again, you get the same thing. This big team of people, they all know their job, they're all very good at it, and it flows really, really well. And the communication from the people in orbit on the station or the space shuttle is very sort of crisp, very clearly defined terms, and everybody understands them. And you kind of hear that when Roland, say, is given the people directions on how he wants a shot done. It's very little words described. This is what I need, and he has his jargon, and the people understand it, and they do it. So you see that same kind of team effort that works so cohesively and makes this, you know, large team of people produce this, all these shots, and ultimately the movie.